Good afternoon. I'm Homi Bhabha. I direct the Humanities Center at Harvard, and it's my great pleasure today to simply start off this event by welcoming Bruce Rich, whose book To Uphold the World we will be talking about. He'll talk, and then Professor Amartya Sen, my friend and colleague, will take it on with a discussion, and he may even actually frame the discussion before with a quick introduction. um, uh, Professor Sen will introduce Bruce Rich more fully, but let me only say that Professor Sen deserves no introduction. However, he always deserves an introduction because he's always doing something new and wonderful in the world. And his new book, An Idea of Justice, was the subject of a half-a-day conference at the Humanities Center with two very wonderful panels and a very full auditorium. And it's always a pleasure to work with him, as indeed it would be a pleasure to work in between him and Bruce Rich. So let me hand over to Professor Amartya Sen, who will say a few words of introduction, after which Bruce Rich will talk about his book.
Actually, Bruce Rich is quite a remarkable. There's this book, and the it's a it's quite a. I have not seen it in that form. Is that a?
That's the American edition from
Oh,
Beacon
is that
Press.
it? I haven't even seen it. I haven't even seen it. Well, as you can see, it's a nicely produced book, but it's a great book too. The thing to recognize about Bruce, there are many things to recognize about him, is that there are really true Bruce Riches in the world. There is an attorney, a qualified lawyer, and a successful practitioner of that. There is a public um, policy-oriented writer and I'd say agitator, and agitator is, in my vocabulary is not a bad word.
Mine neither.
Yeah, and so agitator for very good causes, like environmental causes in particular, on which he has really quite a powerful and commanding voice. And third is his interest in the history of the world, in particular the history of India. But given the other two Bruce Riches that are present, it could never have been just a scholarly work, which it is, but it couldn't have been just that, about the two protagonists, namely Kautilya and Ashoka. The Kautilya in the 4th century BC is the minister to the Maurya king, Chandragupta, minister in the sense of advising. It used to be disputed, but I think it's fairly well established now that even the Chinese word Mandarin is derived from the Sanskrit word mantri, meaning somebody who gives you advice. And it migrated from India to China, not directly, but to Southeast Asia. And there's quite a history there. So he was a Mandarin, really, of the Mauryan Empire. But unlike many Mandarins, he actually wrote what he thought and produced the first book called Arthashastra, which is, in fact, the first book ever called economics. Artha is a material wealth, and Shastra is knowledge, systematic knowledge about it. The systematic knowledge about material wealth, in the same way that Aristotle called his book, well, there was Nicomachean Ethic, and there's another ethic book, but also a book called Politics. This is a book called Economics. But it also goes into political economy and politics. And then there's Ashoka, grandson of Chandragupta, emperor. He becomes the emperor, extends the empire, more or less completing it, and it's the first time there's an all-India empire emerging. but takes a completely different track. And when I first met Bruce Root, I was really very impressed by the way he had thought about both the individual relevance of their respective thoughts as well as the contrast between them. On one side, Kautilya, I'm oversimplifying obviously, and you have to read the book to get the totality. On one side, um, Kautilya with him, with getting the institutions right, and with the skepticism of humanity, the venal view of humanity, which is now standard in economics. That is Kautilya origin, actually. If you want to get people to do something, you better give them incentives. It's the Arthashastra is a stick and carrot book. And of course, Ashoka is arguing very much that that should not be needed. Now that contrast, which I, of course, since I've been interested in these authors, I've been familiar with some time, but what came on very powerfully to me is not just the way Bruce Rich manages to enlighten the respective approaches and philosophies of the two, but also something which actually I cite him for in my own book, namely that if it is the case that the Ashoka's overconfidence on the non-venal view of the perfectionism, as it were, of human beings, if that might have had a role in the disintegration of the empire afterward, there is a question as to why it didn't disintegrate under Ashoka. And I had always thought, I was brought up to think, and I think there are many scholars who commented on it in subsequent post-Maurya Indian ancient discussion, both in the context of jurisprudence and in the context of political governance, that the main reason was Ashoka's intellectual power and the way he was viewed. He was viewed as a kind of extraordinarily difficult person against whom you couldn't argue. I mean, he could get everyone against, even if he disbands the army, which he did. He could raise it at any moment if he wanted to. But it turns out that, in fact, and this is where Bruce has produced, like in many other subjects, additional insights, namely that despite all the rhetoric, Ashoka had actually not fully disintegrated, fully dissolved the Kautilyan, Mauryan arrangement that pre-existed from him. So in that sense, he was a gradualist, and I don't think he had any great difficulty in distinguishing between ultimately a world in which you don't need to depend on the carrots and sticks, and at the same time, he did think that there would be a case for carrots and sticks for things to come, for years to come, and he himself did not jump into the direction of an institution, unregulated world in a big way. So there are great insights there. There are many other ways in which Bruce Rich, I think the attorney, the Bruce Rich, the public activist, comes into the discussion of what happened, not just in the minds of Kautilya and the minds of Ashoka, but in the world around him. And of course, the crowning glory of the book is the relevance of both the Kautilyan perspective and the Ashokan perspective in the contemporary world today. And I think that my diagnosis would be that his own thinking about such as environmental issues have played a big part in making that understanding. If you think about it, the environmental dilemma, say take global warming, on one hand demands institutions like carbon taxes. People are right to demand carbon taxes. But it also demands something more than that, namely environmentally conscious behavior. If the former is in the Kautilyan territory, the latter is in the Ashokan territory. And any kind of global problem that we face today have these two features. They're not conflicting features necessarily, but they supplement each other, and certainly they provide different visions. Now, we will have differences, people will have differences depending on politics, philosophy, and belief in jurisprudence as to the relative importance of the two perspectives. But I think Bruce does an enormously great service to the scholarship of ancient Indian history and ancient Indian, well, variety of subjects, from jurisprudence to economics, to draw attention to the fact that it is possible to benefit from the insights of both the writings and at the same time not deny the importance of the other to the one from which at that moment you're benefiting. So it's a really a great book. I rarely have been in the august company of Dalai Lama, as I am in this book, in endorsing this book. But I agree with Dalai Lama. It's a wonderful book, and I strongly recommend the book. In addition to saying how proud I am to be able to introduce Bruce Rich to you, given his enormous importance in Indian and South Asian studies on one side, his concern with problems of the global world today, and the ability to marry his legal perspective derived from his role as legal education as well as practice as an attorney with the world of thought. I mean, there's sometimes been said that the law is an ass, but while there may be some truth in that, I think what Bruce Rich argues that law need not be quite as much of an ass as it is made out to be. So we're very, very pleased that you are here, Bruce. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Amartya and Homi. I know you're very busy, so I'm very grateful that you've taken time to come here today. And my special thanks to the Harvard South Asia Initiative and to Sugata Bose, who's not here, but who's the chair of the South
Asia Initiative. Yeah, he wanted to convey his apologies. He's in Calcutta now.
Okay, yes, but for hosting me here. Well, the thesis of my talk, which is one of the main themes of my book, is these two great figures of ancient India can tell us about our contemporary social and economic crises. And you might think at first that that's a rather implausible thesis in the sense that really the ancient India, the 3rd or 4th century BC, was a totally different world in many respects. And so what a really practical significance can Ashoka and Kautilya tell us? And I think maybe a good way to start is just to mention something that's been on the minds, I'm sure, of many people here in the past few days. That's to say President Obama's great legislative victory in the House on health care, and a big step towards universal health care. He's not quite all the way there. And of course, many observers have noted that this has been a project in American society going back to President Roosevelt, not just Franklin Roosevelt, but Teddy Roosevelt. Well, I'd suggest that the project of universal health care goes back a lot farther if we can free ourselves a bit from a parochial, cultural, and historical and geographical way of looking at things. Indeed, quite a bit farther to the 3rd century BC, to Ashoka. Now, I'll say a bit more about Ashoka and Kautilya shortly, but he did have a great conversion in his life, following a big battle that he fought in 260 BC, the Battle of Kalinga. It was when he came to power in around 269 BC, it's thought. He continued the policy of his predecessors, expanding the Mauryan Empire, expanding it into what's today Pakistan, and a good deal of even what's contemporary Afghanistan. And one of the biggest battles he needed to fight was in southeast India, in a kingdom called Kalinga, which is approximately today's Orissa state. And after this battle, which was truly bloody, 100,000 people killed, 150,000 people shipped off into captivity. How do we know? Because he wrote this on stone, in edicts inscribed in stone faces all over the Indian subcontinent a few years later. And one of his edicts concerns universal health care. He's proclaiming in these edicts a new ethos, a secular ethic to hold together his multicultural kingdom. He calls it Dhamma, which is from the Prakrit, a vernacular language descended from Sanskrit, and also the Sanskrit term dharma. Means ethics, law, religion, duty, and so on. But for Ashoka, it has a special meaning. It's a secular ethic he's proclaiming for his whole kingdom, according to universal ethical principles. So this is what he says on universal health care. He says that all over his empire, this is from his second so-called major rock edict, he says that everywhere in his empire, and even in the lands on its frontiers and beyond them, and he cites what's today Sri Lanka and Greek-speaking kingdoms beyond his boundaries to the west, and he repeats everywhere. And everywhere for him is not just internally but externally. He's established two medical services. One is for humans, and the other is for animals. And then he says that for medical herbs, whether useful to man or beast, have been brought and planted wherever they did not grow. So you can also say that he's promoting a kind of state subsidization of the pharmaceutical industry, or such as it was in the 3rd century BC, which is basically encouraging the growth of medicinal herbs. Well, this is I would argue, a truly universal concept of healthcare. One, it extends not just to humans, but to animals, and two, not just to his own boundaries, then beyond. Obviously, the Obama healthcare legislation would have gotten very far in the Senate, or the House rather, if it had included subsidizing hospitals in Mexico, let's say, and also setting up a kind of a state-supported Medicare or Medicaid for animals. So it's a universal vision. Now, did he put this into practice? Well, we have some evidence that he did, because for hundreds of years later, travelers who went to India and recounted their experiences noted the presence of these hospitals and medical services for animals as well as humans all over the subcontinent. Two of the most notable of these travelers were two Chinese Buddhist pilgrims, Fa Xian in the 4th century AD, and Xuanzang in the 7th century AD, who reported the presence of these hospitals. So the other interesting thing to note is that Ashoka's healthcare reforms lasted for the better part of a millennium, at least in part, as far as we can tell. It'll be interesting to see what's left of the American healthcare system 800 or 900 years hence. So that's a bit of an introduction. You can find many other examples. Now, obviously, the times have changed, but I think the general principles Ashoka was trying to promote are, in many ways, just as valid as for today, and go much farther in some ways. Certainly, Peter Singer, the philosopher of animal rights at Princeton, would think it would be a great idea to have a state-subsidized medical care for animals, but I don't think we're going to see that in the United States for some time. So, well, a bit more about Ashoka and Kautilya. Many of you may have heard their names. Amartya has given us a bit of an introduction. I think but I'd be surprised if many people here have taken time recently to read Ashoka's edicts or to read this great treatise on economics and statecraft, the Arthashastra of Kautilya. So I'll say a bit about what they tried to promote. Well, Ashoka, after his turning point, you could say, after the Battle of Kalinga, he gradually became a convert to Buddhism, and his Dhamma, the secular ethos, which he set forth in these rock edicts, which were inscribed around 256, 255 AD. It's a remarkable ethos, even for today, because there is, for example, an edict of not just of religious toleration, not just a passive toleration, but of active state support for all religious doctrines and sects. And Ashoka goes on to say in another edict that he thinks that all religions and philosophical sects are really trying to promote a kind of essential doctrine, he calls it, which includes self-control and purity of a mind, and I would also argue respect for life. And he also encourages open debate and discussion among all sects and religions. And he points out if they would stop disparaging one another and listen, they could get to this essential doctrine. They would see what they would have in common. So that's a remarkable vision of a public debate, a kind of predecessor of democratic debate, you could say. I think, obviously is even more relevant in our globalized discussions about ideology and religion today. His edicts include measures for good governance, prompt dispatch of business. He proclaims an end to almost all slaughter of animals, both for ritual purposes, since the Vedic priests of the time did a lot of their business through animal sacrifices, but also proclaims that in the royal kitchens, it almost sounds like hyperbole, but he claims that in the royal kitchens every day, hundreds of thousands of animals used to be slaughtered, and he's reduced this to only 3 per day, 2 peacocks and a deer. And he goes on to say that, and on some days we're not even killing a deer, just 2 peacocks, and in the future we're going to try and stop killing all animals for eating. So that's an interesting approach. And perhaps the most famous of his edicts is the rock edicts is the Kalinga edict, where he declares after this battle of Kalinga and all he was appalled at the suffering and death that it brought, and that he realizes that the greatest victory in conquest is not by force over the external world, it's the conquest over oneself, self-control. And he urges future generations, his descendants and their descendants, and really all, the tone is even of all people, that to think about this. But again, just as with the slaughter of animals in the kitchens, he hedges his bets a tiny bit. He says, I urge all my descendants to know of inner conquest, that's the greatest conquest. Violence is bad. But if you have to somehow use violence, then you should do it reluctantly and be as kindly as possible, and so on. So he's also a person who's running an empire and a state, and that's the great dilemma of politics. You can't renounce force and violence entirely. And in another part of his edicts, he actually says that with regard to certain tribal peoples and other peoples, he doesn't believe in conquest and force, but if they really insist on using force themselves, then he'll be forced to threaten force and violence too. So I think in looking at Ashoka, it's quite, there's a pragmatic element there. He's 90% of the way toward renouncing violence, force, and so on, but not entirely. It kind of reminds me of the famous dictum of St. Augustine in his Confessions when he recounts his youth. He says that he would pray to God, "Oh God, make me chaste, but not quite yet." So there's a bit of that in Ashoka too. If we turn to Kautilya, by the way, in my studying, there are 3 other important points about Ashoka. Is that 12 years later, he inscribed a second series of his edicts on large stone pillars, which you can see in many parts of India, very beautiful pillars that are 60 or 70 feet high. The capital, the carved top of the Ashokan pillar found at Sarnath near Varanasi. It's of course a common place for anyone who from India, but it's not quite so well known for Americans. That this Ashokan column with this beautiful carved capital was chosen as the state seal of India, the symbol of the new Indian secular state in 1947. It's on the back of the 1 rupee coin, and it's on the station area, government station area, and everywhere. Well, in the 12 years later, in these pillar edicts, there are 3 new provisions. One is he calls for uniformity in judicial procedure and punishment, the kind of equal protection of the laws. there is an edict that's kind of an Endangered Species Act. He lists all the species that should be, where it's forbidden to kill these species. He enumerates them. And he says, above all, animals that are totally useless to humans, they should never be killed. And that's a very interesting kind of approach to conservation, because when you look in Kautilya's Arthashastra, he goes into a great deal of detail, and for him, nature conservation is very important too. There's a lot of interesting stuff on management of natural resources, but it's all for a utilitarian end. That's to say, it's important to protect forests, for example, not as a value in itself, but to manage resources for economic purposes or for state security purposes. For example, Kautilya says it's really important to protect elephant forests because elephants are absolutely essential for national security making war. So this has to be a big priority. And that gives you a flavor of Kautilya, you could say. And then finally, the last of Ashoka's edicts, the seventh Pillar Edict, is also quite remarkable because he reflects on his work. He says, for many, many years, I've been trying to promote this Dhamma, this new ethic, and I've tried to do it through legislation and regulation. But I've come to the conviction that that persuasion is more effective than legislation. And I think the Prakrit term that's used for persuasion can mean also reflection and meditation, persuading others but persuading oneself, coming to inner reflection. And he actually cites the example of not killing animals. That he claims that he's seen that people have to realize themselves that it's a bad thing to kill animals and not just regulate it or forbid it. And that's, I think, the crux of the difference between Ashoka and Kautilya, as Amartya has mentioned, because Ashoka seems to be saying, and he's saying this from his own personal experience, because it was his inner conversion and reflection after Kalinga that led to him promulgating this new ethic of reverence for life and justice and so on. And he seems to be saying that if in promoting social change, it's the role of the individual is very important, and the role of individual reflection, thought, choice, and change is really critical, and over the longer term, it might be the most important. Whereas Kautilya, as Amartya noted, has a much more pessimistic, you could even say venal view of human nature. Now, just going to Kautilya briefly, I originally was going to write my book about Ashoka, but then when I studied the period, I realized you couldn't understand Ashoka without understanding Kautilya. And Kautilya preceded Ashoka maybe by about 60 or 80 years. He was the chief minister of Ashoka's grandfather, Chandragupta Maurya, who founded the Mauryan dynasty. But Kautilya was really the brains behind the empire. And we don't know much really historically about his life. There are some very interesting, colorful, mythical accounts about him, which unfortunately I don't have the time to mention right now, but they're in the book. He's really a very colorful character, at least in the stories that were told about him. But his great treatise, the Arthashastra, Artha is material wealth, Shastra is, say, science, had really been semi-lost to the rest of the world until the early 1900s, when it was rediscovered, written on palm leaves in Sanskrit in a monastery in southern India. And when it was translated into Western languages, people were amazed. Max Weber, for example, said that in contrast, quote, in contrast with this document, the Arthashastra, Machiavelli's prince is harmless. So that's a high compliment. And the Indologist Heinrich Zimmer said, I think in the 1940s, that, quote, Kautilya brought the whole historical period into being, unquote, of which Ashoka's reign was the high point. And there are two maybe fundamental principles to remember about the Arthashastra and Kautilya. One, he starts out by reflecting on what are the underpinning principles of society. What's really important? And he says, well, I've given a lot of thought to this, and some people in the past, they've said it's dharma, religion, morality, ethics, and that. They're wrong. Other people say it's danda. That's a Sanskrit word which means stick or military force or what have you. And they say, well, it's whoever can, it's just the rule of the strong against the weak. So whoever can mobilize enough force to push around other people and so on. But all these people are right. They really haven't thought in this to the really thoroughly. It's really the acquisition and management of material wealth, artha, because in a country or society or kingdom, if it's collapsed economically and there's famine, then even the priests turn out to be thieves or even murderers. They're driven to that. And he said that if you have the material wherewithal, even a blind person, a handicapped person, a child, or a widow can, if she has artha, then she can hire an army to conquer a kingdom. So therefore, the state and whoever's running the state, the prince, the king, has to focus on artha above all, and that's his, as a ruler, his dharma, his duty is to focus on that first and foremost. Of course, and then the other aspect of his view of the world is a rather ruthless view of international relations, of realpolitik. He explicitly advocates espionage, use of prostitutes, betrayal, duplicity in numerous forms, burglary, political assassinations, every kind of trick you can imagine, even some you wouldn't have imagined. He loves detail, so he describes very interesting, wily ways to promote the interests of the state. But his realism is a technocratic realism. It's not a despotic realism. So, because it's all in the name of the welfare of the state. And in the Arthashastra, he expounds at length on the minutiae of taxation, irrigation, resources management, foreign policy, how to deal with corruption and prevent it, because he says everyone's corrupt, you can't trust anyone, so you've really got to make this a priority. And so on. All of this to assure the material and political well-being of society and the state. So he's kind of a very modern guy. You can imagine that he'd feel at ease with Henry Kissinger in a meeting of finance ministers today. And the other thing we know about, so Ashoka inherits the system, which is a very well-designed administrative system. And though Kautilya is a controversial character, it would be wrong to present him as someone who's evil or immoral. He's amoral in a technocratic sense, but it's all for a certain notion of the good based on a certain pessimistic view of human nature. And indeed, we have some evidence that he ran a very tight and successful ship, you could say, because the Seleucid Greek ambassador to the court of Chandragupta was a fellow named Megasthenes. And he wrote a book called the Indika, which is the main book that we have on that's come from classical antiquity on India. And he reports that the Mauryan Empire under Chandragupta, and therefore under Kautilya, was this wonderful place. It was a rich, prosperous, very little crime, and actually more humane, interestingly enough, than what you found in Greece. And he cites the example of slavery. He said, well, in Greece we have slavery, and there's no slavery here. Now, that wasn't quite true. There was a form of indentured servitude and so on, but it was much more mild than what you found in the classical Greece, not to speak of Rome, not to speak in the antebellum South of the United States. And many other details. Kautilya talks about women's rights. He says women have the right in some cases to unilaterally declare divorce. If their husband is impotent, for example, or he disappears in a foreign land for a long time, or he's convicted of a crime against the king or what have you. So there's all that's very interesting. So the contrast. Ashoka is optimistic view of human nature and the individual as a force for social change. Kautilya is pessimistic. Ashoka is tolerant. Kautilya is actually, though he seems to be a material revolutionary, he's trying to uphold the old order of a more rigid hierarchy and caste. He advocates discrimination against Buddhists, Jains, some of these other new sects, and so on. And then, as Amartya has said, Kautilya is the ultimate consequentialist. And you can see Ashoka as a deontologist. That's to say, someone who believes in universal ethical principles, and one has to act on these even if you're not sure of the practical consequences or effectiveness. Here I stand, I can't do otherwise. And those two approaches to life, it's a constant, not a dichotomy, but a kind of dialectic, I think, in political thought through the ages. Well, to conclude, I'll just mention a couple of other issues of what Ashoka and Kautilya would tell us today, practically, about how to proceed in the world. Let's imagine that they were advising George W. Bush before the invasion of Iraq. Well, we can bet that Ashoka, we know that he's against violence and war, but he would also say to Bush, well, from my own experience, you underestimate the amount of suffering and death and that war brings, and indeed, which is what happened in Iraq. Think of the hundreds, not just of the invasion, but the hundreds of thousands of Iraqis who were killed in sectarian violence or were driven away as refugees. Ashoka probably could have foreseen a bit of that. Kautilya, well, he's a pretty ruthless guy. I mean, maybe would he be in favor of invading Iraq? Well, no. He sets out a hierarchy of political means that should be used according to their cost and risk. And he says, well, if one state is trying to bend the will of another state, you should first try conciliation and negotiation. That's the least costly, the least risky. That doesn't work. Try gifts, which I think includes bribery too. That's more costly, but it's still not so risky. After that, try fomenting internal dissension. Maybe send secret agents to foment a coup or something like that, a standard tactic. Well, that's more costly, can be more risky. But the riskiest of all, and the most costly, of course, is armed force. So Kautilya says in the Arthashastra, he said, well, that's the order, and you should try the least costly and the least risky things first. And so he would have advised against this war too. Well, last issue, and this is sort of where I'll conclude, is I think one can argue that looking at a globalized world, that the greatest challenge facing the world today is, well, in the words of the theologian Hans Kung, is that a global market economy requires a global ethic. George Soros has said, quote, that the supreme challenge of our time is to establish a set of fundamental values that applies to a largely transactional global society. And one can name others, John Gray of the London School of Economics, Václav Havel. It's all that we need an Ashokan ethic, you could say, for a Kautilyan world. And they cite three main sources, which I find quite interesting. One is the Ethics of Aristotle. The second is Adam Smith, but the other book that Adam Smith wrote, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, because Adam Smith has been misrepresented and I think in popular political discourse as a person who somehow advocated the primacy of economic efficiency and of market principles in every single area of human society, where that's not the case. And in the Theory of Moral Sentiments, he said that that you have to have a framework of social values, and there's three of them that he emphasizes: justice, prudence, which is a combination of foresight and self-control, individually and collectively, seeing the consequences longer term of our actions and taking shorter term actions to not just to look for short-term advantage, and then beneficence and compassion, welfare, you could say. And there's a great quote of Smith. He says, quote, justice. He says you can have a society that's lacking beneficence and even prudence, but he says, quote, justice is the main pillar that upholds the whole edifice. If it is removed, the great immense fabric of human society must in a moment crumble to atoms. And when I first read that, I was struck by the strength of it. And then for some reason, the famous or infamous dictum of Margaret Thatcher popped into my mind, where she was reported to have said, there's no such thing as society. There's only individuals and families pursuing individual interests. And then I thought, well, actually, Margaret Thatcher's dream, in a way, was Adam Smith's nightmare. And which I think is the extent of the way his legacy is somehow has been misrepresented. And last year was the 250th anniversary of his publishing of the Theory of Moral Sentiments. There's a new edition for which Amartya has written the introduction or the foreword. And in these debates over globalization, Adam Smith and the theory of moral sense become more relevant than ever. I would argue what Ashoka was trying to do was, for his time, promoting these virtues of, in a social framework, justice, prudence, and benevolence. He was trying to re-embed the Kautilyan technocracy of the Mauryan Empire into this framework of social values. And of course, the third source that many of these globalization critics cite is Karl Polanyi, the Great Transformation. One of his principal idea really is that the economy is embedded in a framework of it's always been embedded in a framework of social values, and then if it's somehow disembedded, it becomes where means become ends, then there's inevitably a social backlash against that. So I'll conclude by perhaps with a quote from Tagore, because it struck me as very meaningful in my own itinerary and looking at Ashoka and Kautilya. I became more and more convinced of their relevance as archetypal figures in thinking about global problems, thinking about justice and politics, and as sources of inspiration and metaphors, and even sometimes as two of the greatest figures of history who have direct lessons for our society. And Tagore wrote in the early 20th century that, quote, "Ashoka's thought has been standing on the wayside for all these ages, longing to find a refuge in the mind of every human." And perhaps my concluding thought in the book is that perhaps this time has come. Well, thank you, and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Bruce Rich, for that very, dare I say it, rich and wide-ranging discussion, which moved from the area of your specialization very widely through the 18th and 19th centuries in particular, suggesting that there's a kind of a very significant reading and reinterpretation of the Enlightenment in relation to the theories of the Arthashastra and Kautilya and so on that you mentioned. So I think this might be the moment either to turn to you or to the audience. Okay. Could we have some questions, please?
This is to try to speculate how figures of the past might have judged heated controversies of our own time is indeed a fascinating game, and I thank you for introducing it. And I'd like to play it too. Of course, in advising a chief executive like George W. Bush in early 2003 whether or not to invade Iraq, we have to match our own principles and beliefs with most of all, our understanding of the specific situation encountered. Now, naturally, it's obvious that at that time I was, and like Tony Blair, remain a passionate hawk, and you were a dove. And it's very easy for us to imagine that these two great figures of the past would have agreed with our thinking at that time. Perhaps you too have been watching C-SPAN and Tony Blair and others testified before the Shillcroft Commission recently. But I wonder...
want you to move to your question,
right,
please, because we've got 15 minutes and a number of people want to...
Right, I've gotten to my question, which is there any justification that you can think of for my suspicion that there's a good chance either or both Ashoka or Kautilya would have agreed with my hawkish advice rather than your dovish advice?
Thank you.
Well, I'm glad you asked that question, because obviously you're right, it depends on the factual situation, and of course hindsight is always 100% accurate, and so one can conceive. Look, let's take Kautilya in particular. His argument in using this descending order of measures to deal with the state depends on the perception of danger and strength of the state that you're dealing with. He actually says, well, for a weaker state, negotiation and bribery and gifts, that tends to work. For a stronger state, where you've got a bigger problem, then you've got to use you try fomenting internal subversion and dissension, or even you may have to use go to war. So certainly as a thought experiment. So I think my point is that these Ashoka and Kautilya, whether one was a hawk or a dove, that their analysis and their way of looking at things can be quite useful for today as a way of thinking about things. But naturally, you have to look at what you believe to be the fact situation in a particular moment. So I would say, yes, one could imagine accepting your assumptions and so on, that would be the case. I don't think it's really important. I cited that as an example because I suppose I had a more dovish predisposition, and also many people at the time warned against going to war so rashly. But I don't. But why don't we leave it at that? I think your question is a very useful question. I think we could, whether you're a hawk or a dove, you can learn from the analysis of Ashoka and Kautilya.
So your book is very much about the process of thinking and reaching solutions, not simply about giving solutions. It's about the whole process
well, of course,
of thinking.
And that's the only way we can use people from long ago, obviously.
Thank you.
Yeah, this is just one comment about Kautilya's the key. The first aphorism that actually, in Sanskrit it says Jivanasya Moolam Dharmam, and the next one is Dharmasya Moolam Artham. So the first one, it says actually just the Kautilya begins by saying the purpose of life is inner harmony. And the next one it says, but in order to have inner harmony inside oneself, in human beings, you need a harmonious state. And that's where he begins. So I just wanted to actually just add that, when you mentioned Ashoka, you mentioned that about his inner conquest, and that you emphasized it. So I just wanted to add that. But also I would like you to actually just comment on the fact that Kautilya was a challenger to the existing state.
Oh.
And so as a result, his thinking was influenced by the need to establish a stable government or an empire, versus Ashoka, who was an incumbent, and he had the luxury of actually, just being born in a established empire as the emperor.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a great point, and of course, two observations. One, yes, it's absolutely true. Kautilya says he's promoting dharma too, ethics, what's the right thing to do, but in the context of the state and the hard practical demands of the state, he says that you really have to, the Dharma has to pay attention to artha and to the acquisition and management of material wealth, and also the use of force, but it's the state. He puts a big emphasis on the state treasury because that's what upholds the army and everything else. And then your point about him using his approach to come into power is a very important one, because we don't know a great deal. We suspect he's a real historical person, but what we have are semi-mythical accounts from different chronicles and so on. But it's quite true that Chandragupta was advised by Kautilya and came into power to overthrow the previous dynasty, the Nanda dynasty. And then at the end of the Arthashastra, I think the very last line is, Kautilya says, "Why I wrote this Arthashastra to describe the means of upholding the state, but also how I also as to have overthrown this previous dynasty of these of the Nandas." And of course, the story is that Kautilya was a kind of a resident intellectual in the court of the Nanda king, but he was supposedly quite physically ugly and uncouth. So, and he was entrusted with running a charitable foundation for the Nanda king, but he wasn't invited to the various social functions that would have been normal for someone of his status. So he felt very angry, and that one myth has him fleeing the kingdom sort of secretively in the night and vowing he's going to do what he can to overthrow this king and this court. And one day he walks through a town and he sees a 10-year-old boy ordering other boys. The boy is playing king, and he's ordering other boys. He says, "You be the general, you're going to be my minister of state." And that guy. And Kautilya sees this kid, and he says, "This guy has really got potential." He becomes his godfather and subsidizes his education. Of course, the boy is Chandragupta. And then the two together wage their campaigns against the Nandas and others and come to power on the throne. So a lot of his statecraft is set out in the Arthashastra is linked to, as you point out, to his waging war against other states and negotiating with them, using every trick possible to come to power and then establish an empire.
Could you introduce yourself, please, before you ask your question?
Sure. I'm Anirudh Suri. I'm a student at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. I think my question would have also given that away. My question is actually directed to all the panelists. So I would love it if Professors Bhabha and Sen could also comment on this. So this is a fascinating theme. So thank you so much for writing a book on this, Mr. Rich. My question is, assume that you were giving advice to Prime Minister Manmohan Singh today, who also has a sort of emphasis on economic growth and societal harmony as the fundamental pillars of India going forward. What would be the sort of the key lessons that you would draw out for him, based on what you've seen of what Kautilya and Ashoka thought and wrote about? And I'm specifically thinking of two issues that I would love if some of the panelists could address. One is this entire issue of political violence that India is dealing with, so counterinsurgencies, etc. And also the second being coalition politics and the management of very diverse interests in India. How would you think that Ashoka and Kautilya would have advised Prime Minister Singh today?
Well, maybe we should first turn to somebody who has off and on advised Prime Minister Singh. Let us hear.
Thank you.
Let us hear from the font of the man who's actually done it, and then the rest of us can fantasize about it.
No, I think I think the first thing to say that there's a great insight to be obtained from Kautilya and Ashoka, but I don't think it boosts his thesis that all our practical advice today have to emerge from 4th and 3rd century BC. I mean, there are one or two things have been learned since then also. Right. But on the specific subject, and I would take an opportunity of commenting on an issue that somebody else wrote earlier about inner harmony and the role of the state, on which Kautilya speaks, that there's one very important way of recognizing Kautilya's similarity with contemporary economics. It has a relevance to your question, where contemporary economics did influence, and Manmohan was a great economist before he became first the reformer, the finance minister, and then the prime minister of the country. But you see, the venal view of humanity is shared by Kautilya and modern economics. It's the common feature of standard economics, not Adam Smith, which I'm glad that Bruce discussed that, and which I tried to discuss in my own foreword to a different book, namely Smith's Moral Sentiment. But that's one aspect. But the other aspect of, along with the venality of humanity, which is shared, Kautilya is absolutely convinced that laissez-faire is not going to get you anywhere. There are all kinds of things that you have to do through the state. And I think the quotation that was made was quoted to us, and I think rightly, is that even for inner harmony of the individual, you need some external role of state and the society and so on. And Kautilya is absolutely splendid in that respect, as is Ashoka. And that's the point where Kautilya and Ashoka are on the same side, as opposed to modern economics, of the market-based economics. I say modern economics because economics wasn't quite like that, not even in the That's not the way Mill and Marx and even Walras and Wicksell thought. But in contemporary economics, they're quite different. Now, I think if you think of, I mean, let me, since I've been put on the map in an ad hominem way, let me answer your question, which is easier to do.
In a historical way.
Okay, thank you. But I had a period when I had disagreement with Monmouth. I mean, when he became, and we had a little bit of, I think, probably, I mean, he had always been a very close friend. I remember his arrival as an undergraduate in Cambridge. I went to see him. And I remember also being blinded by, he was washed a lot of his turbans, and they were kind of colorful turbans crisscrossing the room in St. John's College, and I could hardly find my way to find the future Prime Minister of India, then a first-year undergraduate. He was a totally remarkable economist. But when he moved there at the time, 1991, 92, when the reforms came, he was, I think, very much a kind of focused on modern economics, and therefore the reform, the role of the market, was much stronger in that thing than, and that is the withdrawal of the state from areas where it could do no good. And he said very little about the role of the state in areas in which they could do a lot of good, and it wasn't doing. That is, I think I would like to have, and indeed I'd argued with him. In fact, I wrote an essay also at that time, saying that the right thing would be to say that the state is overextended in some areas where it shouldn't be, and state is underextended in some areas which it should be. And then it became quite clear. I mean, I think we came out to a position that I think that he wasn't doing that at all. And by the time, in fact, when he was elected and became Prime Minister of the country, he went straight in the direction of a dual statement, that we have to extend the role of the state in poverty removal, education, etc., 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 and continue the path of withdrawing state from those areas. So I think if you take that view, what was he doing? I think he was, in some ways, in my judgment, completing his analysis. You see, Kautilya, on one side, I mean, these are not inside ancient India, for 3rd century BC, or 4th century in his case, is not like India of the post-colonial era. But he was asking the question, what is it that the state can fruitfully do, and what is it it couldn't? I mean, Ashoka discusses, Kautilya discusses famine prevention also, and the state has a positive role, one of the first to do so in the world. And so he extended this thing, and basically, as I read one part of Kautilya's thing, that take institutions very seriously and try to see what it can do and what it can do well, and what it couldn't do. And that's why when Bruce was saying that if you were to advise Iraq, it's clear that Ashoka would have been on the dovish side, that relates to your question, rather than the hawkish side. I think that I don't see any kind of argument that could have convinced Ashoka to go in for the Iraq war. I think in case of Kautilya, it could have, because he didn't have that attitude about war as such. On the other hand, and he was the ultimate consequentialist in philosophical terms. But he's also saying that don't be daft about these things, and bear in mind what the institutions can achieve and what it cannot achieve. And that is, of course, an invitation to us today in our world to reason in just the same way. He said, this would be a good thing, that's not. Now, the world he was trying to promote is not our world. It's a stratified world. It's a caste-ridden world. It's a world in which it may be that they're against Matsanaya, as the Indian legal theorists used to say, disorder. But the order is one which is a stratified order. Everyone knows his place. And as long as you know your place, no big fish is going to eat you up, as long as you're doing what you have been permitted to do in this stratified society. But Ashoka is raising the question there, is to say, is that really what we want? If we were to reason how would we reason about it? And I think the importance of reasoning with other people is absolutely central. And I was so delighted that Bruce, in his book too, and here to emphasize that public reasoning is very central. He's putting around stone fillers everywhere, beginning with the Kalinga thing, how he made a mistake. And the number he quoted of prisoners, as well as death, is Ashoka confessing, saying, this happened. And it made me feel full of profound grief because I had made a mistake. So it's that, the re-examination, in this case, not just of the institution as in Kautilya, of the values that comes in. And I think that issue that is very engaged in Indian democracy. We haven't got it all right continuously. I see that there's this new thing going on about women's representation in parliament, which I think is a very positive thing. And on the other hand, one has to discuss whether it's the right thing to do. But what makes it immediately worth considering is the valuational change. Women are not viewed in contemporary India in the way they have traditionally been viewed in ancient India and perhaps even more so in medieval India. And it's that reach that exists. And I don't think Manmohan Singh or anybody else would not be affected by this duality of type of reasoning, one about institutional efficacy, and the other is the need to re-examine not just the role of institutions, but our values and how we get on with each other. I think that, I don't think Manmohan would be regarded as a practical advice about excise duties. On the other hand, that's what seems to me most relates to the book, because it's not advice on excise duties that you will get from Bruce's book or the Bruce's two protagonists. They have much to say to there, but at a much more general level.
Yes, please.
Well, one thing that I think that is quite relevant in Kautilya, actually, is that he's quite obsessed with corruption, looking at a big bureaucracy, and he says that it's as difficult to know whether any government official is on the take as it is to know whether a fish is imbibing water. So, and he goes into great detail about all kinds of measures that have to be taken on a quarterly and annual basis to get officials to present accounts and have them double-checked and that sort of thing to make sure that the corruption isn't there. And he advocates public humiliation and shaming of officials who are corrupt. He says an official is found to be corrupt should be covered with dung and ashes and thrown outside the town or the village and that kind of thing. Of course, we can't do that now today, but maybe if we could, there might be an effective deterrent. So I think in part of the weakness from, and I'm probably out of my depth here, but I'm going to answer your question anyway, just on a very personal basis. I think this issue of corruption is a problem all over the world, in every country, and I think it's gotten worse in the past 15 or 20 years with a sort of an atmosphere of deregulation, and the market knows best in many countries. So Kautilya would probably advise very strongly that corruption has to be addressed much more vigorously and thoroughly. And of course, Ashoka was in his edicts he calls quite explicitly for the prompt dispatch of business. He says, I'm going to be sitting up at all hours and act on things quickly and this kind of thing, the prompt dispatch of business. So there are real nuggets of practical wisdom embedded in these voices from 22 or 2300 years ago that are, I think, relevant for the management of any state today, and including or especially India.
Thank you all for being here. Please enjoy tea and conversation outside the room. Thank you.